Good evening. My name is Ilya Belenki, and I welcome all of you on behalf of Harvard Ukrainian Summer Institute. We continue our summer seminar series and moving to history, or its present, or its long present. Our guest today does not need any special introduction, but I will say a few words about his latest achievements, and there are many. Serhiy Plokhy is Mikhail Hrushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History here at Harvard, and until about 9 days ago, he was also director of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute for 12 years. Professor Plokhy is among the most recognized and most prolific historians of Ukraine and Eastern Europe that this continent has ever seen. He has published on a multitude of topics, including, and I probably will miss something, religion and society in early modern Ukraine, Cossacks, historiography, and Mikhail Hrushevsky in particular, World War II, Chernobyl, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and most recently, the Russo-Ukrainian War. His most recent books include, and I have a long list, but I will leave it myself to this decade. And I will start from the most recent one, which is Chernobyl Roulette, War in the Nuclear Disaster Zone, published in 2024. The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, 2023. Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters, 2022, The Frontline, Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present, 2021, and Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 2021. His books received numerous awards, and I will mention only two: the Bell Clifford Prize for Chernobyl, and the Shevchenko National Prize in Ukraine, 2018, for The Gates of Europe, Ukrainian translation. And just last month, Professor Plokhy received an honorary degree from Oxford University, so congratulations. I'm grateful to Professor Plokhy for not ignoring our summer school, for appearing basically every summer before students and our guests with a new topic, which is a remarkable achievement. So this has become our innate tradition. And today's talk is titled Atoms for Peace, at the Time of War, Lessons from the Front Lines of Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Professor Plokhy.
Thank you, Serhiy, for this introduction. It's always a pleasure to participate in this lecture series, to see new faces, and to really contribute to our work on spreading good knowledge about Ukraine. This is a very important mission that Harvard continues despite all sorts of issues and all sorts of attacks on the higher education and Harvard in particular. And it's also something that is extremely important for really maintaining and certainly mobilizing support for Ukraine. So again, it's a pleasure to be part of that particular program of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. My talk is based on my book that was published in the fall of the last year. It is called The Chernobyl Roulette, A War in the Nuclear Disaster Zone. And the title of the book is related, the title of today's talk is of course related to that, but it's a little bit different. I was looking for a different title for the talk, and then we just had a discussion with one of the participants of this event that the war and the bombing of the nuclear sites in Iran suddenly gave additional urgency for the entire theme and entire topic of nuclear sites, nuclear facilities at the time of war and what is happening with them. So I thought that the topic couldn't be more related and more urgent to the current events, given the conditions of the war in Ukraine and given the fact that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, is still under the occupation. But then certainly the events in the Middle East added additional urgency to what we are going to talk about today. So the talk will be very much focused on Ukraine, but they will be also closer to the conclusion. I will talk about broader significance of what we see in Ukraine, what we experience there. So the story in my book is very much focused on the occupation of Chernobyl nuclear power plant between the start of the all-out war. So it was the 24th of February of 2022 when the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was taken over, and the Russian troops withdrew from there in late March, once the Ukrainian armed forces were able to push back the Russian army from Kyiv. So the battle for Kyiv was lost by Russia, and eventually they withdrew from Chernobyl as well. During the very same time, the attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant took place, the occupation of Zaporizhzhia. So at least one chapter of the book is dealing with Zaporizhzhia. So what really happened in Ukraine, and why Chernobyl suddenly found itself in the middle, in the headlines once again, in the conditions of the war? I want to start with kind of a little personal anecdote. When the all-out war started, I was in Vienna at that time. I described that experience in the introduction to my book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. And I was working on the book that probably I will never write, on the international history of Chernobyl nuclear disaster. So I was working in the archives of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And that the day of the war, that was also, there were already files waiting for me. I was working there for 1 month, roughly. I was getting closer to what I wanted to get. And I went there, went through those files, took a couple of pictures here and there. Certainly my mind was somewhere else at that time. And I left the International Atomic Energy Agency really thinking that what I am doing, the whole agency, everything around me is so far removed from what is important, what is happening in Ukraine. The irony was that I was living the building that was at that very same time when I was living, it was becoming a very important part of the story about Chernobyl, because International Atomic Energy Agency was eventually and became part of the story of my book as well. But the point that I'm trying to make by this anecdote, that I didn't think about nuclear energy, I didn't think about Chernobyl, or being in any way significant to the war. But it became, and the reason is why. Why the Russian army occupies Chernobyl. Why we are having the war in Ukraine going nuclear in that particular meaning of the term already in the first hours of the war. Well, the answer is roughly on this map. That's the way of the Russian advance toward Kyiv, advance from Belarus. So the easiest and the closest way to Kyiv was through Belarus, and then marching through the Chernobyl Chernobyl exclusion zone. Something that very few people really expected. Bringing the Chernobyl nuclear zone with all sorts of radiation into the center of the war, into the center of this operation. Of course, it was a big surprise. That's one thing that comes to mind. Ukrainians were not prepared. The troops that were in the Chernobyl zone were mostly to guard the border with Belarus, expecting that Lukashenko could actually send Middle Eastern migrants to Ukraine the same way how he was doing that with Poland. But that was not, of course, enough to do anything with the advancing Russian army. What this map also demonstrates, and that's the Chernobyl zone, that is the levels of contamination around Chernobyl zone. It demonstrates something that we would see later in the war in abundance. It's a complete disregard for human life and the health of your own soldiers and your own officers and your own personnel. because immediately once the troops started to go into the Chernobyl zone, the information started to arrive immediately in real time to Vienna, to the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, because the entire Chernobyl zone is full of the equipment to measure the level of radiation. So the tanks, the heavy equipment moving through the zone, of course, was raising dust, and dust was radioactive. Of course, the Russian soldiers and officers and others were right there, right in the middle of all of that. That's one of the commanders of the Russian troops there, General Borakov, which is an interesting story. I'll return to that about that particular officer. But I want to, before that, I want to say a few words about the zone itself and what was happening there at the time when the war started. So a few years before the war, the new sarcophagus, the new safe confinement was built over the damaged fourth reactor of the nuclear power plant. And the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was shut down already in the year 2000, so no reactors were operating, but the spent fuel was still there. There were the ponds, the water containers where the spent fuel was still sitting there. It was still radioactive. You need electricity to power pumps that would bring actually water there to cool, so that they're still overheated, those elements. And then there was, of course, a significant group of people, all around 100 people, who were also monitoring the new safe confinement for the fourth reactor, dealing with the other technical issues on the zone, because there were two types of the nuclear storage facilities. And then there was a new storage facility that Ukraine just built before the start of the war to house also the spent fuel from other reactors. So it's a big, still, despite the fact that the nuclear power plant doesn't work, it's still a very big industrial complex where people work, and where there is also the the Ukrainian National Guard, mostly to deal with stalkers, so with people with the illegal tourism into the zone, and given that this is a nuclear site, just to protect it from, not from the tanks, not from the army, but from potentially some maybe minor terrorist attacks of that sort. So that's what is there on the morning of the 24th of February of 2022. And then the Russian army is showing up there. I approached the topic of the Russian occupation of Chernobyl plant having in mind a couple of objectives. The first one, I was interested to figure out actually what was going on there, what was in the minds of the Russian occupational forces, the people who were making decisions, who were on the ground there, what was in the mind of the Ukrainians, what does the occupation meant. But I looked at that also in some historical perspective, being a historian of Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I published a book on that. As I said, in Vienna, I was working on the same topic. So for me, there was also a big question about the society. So nuclear industry and society, the nuclear accident is society. How societies deal with that, how they act, what changed, what did not change. And what I found out was that there was a striking difference between the behavior of the Russian army and the behavior of the Ukrainian personnel on the station. Admittedly, I was not comparing apples and apples. I was not comparing most of the time the Russian nuclear engineers to the Ukrainian engineers. The Russian army it's a particular institution, but still I was looking at those two groups as representing of what changed since the fall of 1991 in Russia and Ukraine. So trying in that way through this microhistory answer also a bigger question about the war, about two societies. And in a very simplistic way, what I found out was that actually there was very little change in terms of the Russian society in comparing to 1986. I mean such things as, again, I talked already about that, a disregard for any sort of rules and regulations, really lack of responsibility on the lower levels, that all responsibility really resides with people at the top. Disregard of people in the top and any new level of leadership for the health and life of people who work under you. And then very different picture we got on the Ukrainian side, and I will be talking about that, about actually people taking individual responsibility, the level of self-organization, the making of decisions on the spot for which there are no actually answers anywhere, either in legal code or international laws. I will be talking about that. So what I will now describe, I will talk about the Russian side, and then I will move to the Ukrainian side, and eventually the third block will be, I talk about something that I promised at the beginning, and that would be the more broader international implications of the Chernobyl story. So this is General Burakov, who was the commander of the troops of the Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia. And this is Colonel Frelenkov, who was second in command. Both of them got awarded with the Golden Star of the Hero of Russia for allegedly saving the world from another Chernobyl, from another nuclear disaster. Frelenkov became a public face of that Russian act that was presented as an act of heroism and saving the world from Ukrainian nationalist battalions who otherwise would attack Chernobyl and blame it on Russia. But General Burakov actually was not publicly acknowledged by Frelenkov anywhere. Burakov came from the headquarters of Rosgvardia in Moscow, and through the entire war till now stays completely in shadows, realizing that, of course, what was happening there, or his commanders realizing that that was and certainly would be charged as the act of nuclear terrorism. So the public face became Frelenkov, who came from one of the provincial towns in southern Russia with his Rosgvardia battalion. So they got to Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the second half of the day of February 24th because they lost their way. So that's a traditional story. They got the wrong maps. Some of the maps coming from 1986. So they arrived quite late, but they arrived well prepared. So apart from Rosgvardia, they had tank, and they had also the special trained Spetsnaz commander unit. They put the gun of the tank, they aimed right at the headquarters of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and then Burakov and Frelenkov went to negotiate, where they said, okay, either you, because there was around 200 soldiers of the Ukrainian National Guard, and they told, either you lay down weapons or there will be mid-ground. We'll destroy all of them. Negotiations lasted for probably 10 to 15 minutes. The unit already kind of got advice from some people who were later charged with treason by the SBU, lay down weapons. So they laid down weapons. And then the most interesting part was the negotiations with the Ukrainian foreman, Valentin Heiko. I'll talk about him later. But there was interesting part about Russian troops' preparation for that operation. The commander unit, ironically, was being trained to take over the nuclear power plant at the Kursk nuclear power plant that got into the news last year because the Ukrainian troops were approaching it in Kursk region. And the Kursk nuclear power plant is, in terms of its layout, in terms of, it's quite close to Chernobyl. So they without any difficulty penetrated that perimeter, so opened the gates, so that was executed perfectly. The problem is that neither Frelikov, nor Burakov, nobody else knew what they were getting into. They had to be explained that this nuclear power plant is not working anymore, that there's special operation, there are special rules, and so on and so forth. And till the very end, even after withdrawing from Chernobyl, Frelikov on the Russian TV was saying that he was threatened, which was true by the Ukrainian foreman, that if they do not do this and that they would explode the station. He still believed that there were reactors that were actually functioning on the station. So zero preparation in terms of where excellent execution of how they get there, how they take over, but they didn't know what they were getting. And the regular soldiers didn't know either what it was, that it was Chernobyl, that it was nuclear, that it was dangerous, and so on and so forth. Once they realized that they didn't know what they got into, and the real the power in many ways was with the Ukrainian personnel, because they knew where things were, what the operational procedures were, what was dangerous, what was not dangerous. They summoned people from Rosatom. And this is one of the generals. His name was Milukin, who was part of the Rosatom system, who invited also representatives of Rosatom. They walked around. They actually admitted that they didn't know what to do with the station. The operation, the equipment was quite unique. And eventually, till the very end, they had to rely on the Ukrainian personnel. And in a way, there was a kind of a power sharing agreement, which I will be talking about, in which the Ukrainian personnel, using its knowledge of the station, was able to a degree kidnap the kidnappers, given the knowledge of the station. Now, what we see there, what I found there, was also something that I didn't really expect. The Russian commanders believing in their own propaganda. So the justification for the occupation of Chernobyl that was provided by the Russian media in the first day of the war was, first of all, the nationalist battalions are there and there, because the entire operation was prepared to fight nationalist battalions, not the Ukrainian army, that they could capture a nuclear power plant, they can blow it up, they can blame that on Ukraine. But then another level of explanation was, while Ukrainians were actually close to getting a nuclear bomb, and where, of course, they were doing all of that in the Chernobyl nuclear zone, because allegedly it's an exclusion zone, you can't get there. Well, there was no place in Ukraine that was more monitored by the Western officials, governments, anybody, the Chernobyl zone. If you want to build a bomb, you actually get as far from Chernobyl as you can, not going to Chernobyl. But that's not that was actually communicated to the commanders there. So they were looking for the American laboratories there. I'm serious about that. They are going to bulldoze the old, from 1986, the burial sites for the highly contaminated equipment and other things. They're working with 1986 maps of Chernobyl. So that was one surprising thing for me, that what you see in the newspapers and you think this is bizarre and this is just, it's a bizarre propaganda, but then going down there, that was something that they believed in, or at least had to execute those orders that were coming from the top. Another big thing was, again, disregard for any source of safety and your own personnel. So once they realized that they were staying there, they started to dig trenches like this ones. This is on the edge of the Red Forest, the most contaminated area in the entire zone. Why? Because there was a road there, according to their manuals, there was supposed to be a checkpoint. So they were dug in there. The Russian soldiers were living in those conditions of radioactive really poisoning, without shower, without anything, just week in and week out. The Ukrainian personnel didn't know about that because that was far away from the station itself. When I was writing this book, I described this episode and I wrote, it looks like they never watched the HBO miniseries on Chernobyl. And my editor said, well, that is not appropriate cross account. But there were other funny episodes. One of the soldiers reading Orwell's 1984. Which again, it was a very popular book at that time in Russia in February of 2022. What he was getting, what he was not getting there, but that was another interesting episode. So yes, this disregard for human life, which is basically exactly the story of 1986. And that's what some of the Ukrainian operators who were there in 86, 87 recognized. And that influenced also the behavior of the Ukrainian personnel. So what was new, which was not there during Chernobyl 1986, it's looting. It was the army of looters. They were stealing and taking everything. The purpose, the immediate purpose actually was to sell and get alcohol for that. And then some of that stuff was shipped into Belarus. So the episodes are when they were leaving the station, the good tires and other things were thrown out of the cars of personnel, armored personnel vehicles, because there was not enough space to put in some hard drives from the computers or whatever they were trying, they were getting it. The situation was much worse outside of Chernobyl station, in Chernobyl per se, because here in the Chernobyl station, there was still the high military commanders. The nuclear power plant was considered to be a safe place to be, because during the war time, considering that the Ukrainians would not attack the nuclear power plant, that's exactly didn't happen. So there was oversight of top commanders through the entire months. There was 3 or 4 generals that were changing one another, and the Ukrainian personnel appealed to them. So there was some control, but then when they decided to withdraw, all the officers left the station 3 or 4 hours before the rank and files left, leaving the station for 4 hours for looting. And before the officers left, they forced the 2 foremen at that time were Ukrainian foremen to sign an act where they were saying that actually the Russian army was providing security for the station, and that they have no complaints about what happened there. So the foreman couldn't not sign the document. They signed it. What they added, they were added actually something that normally you don't see in the documents like that. Not just the date, but the hour when they signed it. Because 2 hours late, the officers left, leaving the station for the soldiers for looting. That was something that, again, as a historian of 1986, I didn't see in 1986. Occasionally, again, in those abandoned villages, people would take a television set just to use it in the station, but they were all educated enough to understand and that, okay, you don't take contaminated stuff, or you don't take the stuff from the station. So in terms of the Soviet society versus Russian society, in that particular context, that was something new that I didn't have before. That's a real hero of the story, Valentin Heiko, the guy who turned 60 under occupation, and the guy who really turned tables on the Russian commanders. There was interesting conversation that took place when the National Guard already laid down weapons. So they invited into Heiko's office. So he said, introduce yourselves, who you are, I'm here representing Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And they told who they were, and they said that their task is whatever, going after nationalist Banderites and so on and so forth. He said, well, that's probably only engineer can ask sort of question like that. Do you have a definition of what nationalist or Banderite is? The officers looked at each other, smiled, said, no. He said, well, if you don't have a definition, you can start with arresting me. And eventually he told them, okay, that's a very particular area. Either you act according to the Ukrainian rules and international rules, or you will basically get radiation poisoning and you will die. And eventually they created a system where in some areas, the Russian officers and commanders could get in without a permission from Heiko, his second in command. So some areas you had to also get approval from the Ukrainian staff. He refused to take any assistance that was sent from outside, which was a very controversial thing with many Ukrainian personnel, because those guys ran out of cigarettes. That was a big issue. That was a big problem. So Heiko's decision not to take any assistance from Russia was a controversial one for that particular reason. He is. I never met him, but I watched a lot of interviews with him. He comes a lot like a very quiet, sort of a geek type of personality. Sort of a computer geek, but he turned out to be extremely strong in terms of his position, of how he was running that. He told the personnel that you came with me, you will live with me, I will not live without you. So he was a real leader for that particular group, and as I said, really changed the dynamics. He openly despised the Russian commanders. And I knew that from his own interviews, but also from interviews of the staff. And then I found a confirmation for that in Colonel Frelinkov's interview on Russian TV, when Frelenkov was saying that this guy was threatening him with blowing up the nuclear power plant if he was not doing this, and that. So then I realized that, okay, that's for real. What I'm getting from the Ukrainian side, this is not just some sort of a bravado after the event that I was so heroic, and the level of kind of that he despised them came from very much of his experience. He started at Chernobyl in 1987. he witnessed the Soviet commanders sending the 19, 20-year-old kids, using them as biorobots to clean the territory of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And he saw the same, and again, in conditions of 86, 87, you couldn't be a colonel or general, you were not running the show. The people like Legasov and others, the scientists were in command and ordering generals around. So he had this kind of a sense of not being afraid of big stars. And one conversation with one of the generals, not Burakov, with other, he was saying that, how you're going to sleep at night? You brought these kids here, the Russian soldiers. They were healthy, you are sending him there and there. Just listen what I am telling you. So there was this kind of a moral also position where he didn't accept that. He didn't accept the occupation. And he was quite open and outspoken in that result. And that was an interesting story, looking at occupation and what is collaboration, what is not collaboration. Because when the shifts eventually were changed, they had to go and cross the Dnipro River, and the bridge was blown, and there was a problem to find the boats, the fishermen who would agree to bring one group on the one side, on the Ukrainian side of the river, and on the Belarusian one. And the fishermen were saying that we don't want actually to help collaborators. So they stayed at the station. Technically, they were collaborators. So eventually they found a couple of people. But the whole thing was, what was Heiko doing there? Was he collaborating with the occupiers? Was he saving the station and the world and the country from another nuclear disaster? The Ukrainian legislation has describe that sort of situations. The international law also doesn't suggest that. The Heiko was saying that, okay, I swore allegiance to Ukraine, but also I abide by the International Atomic Energy Agency rules, which say that actually in the conditions of the emergency, you have no right to leave your working place. So that was his position. In Heiko's eyes, there was one traitor, and that was a traitor who refused to stay at the station, who left the station to join his family in Slavutich, 70 or something kilometers away, going through the woods occupied by Russia, being in the middle of the war. So that guy who refused to collaborate decided to join his family. In that particular code that Heiko created there was a traitor. So this issue is unresolved in any sort of legislation, in the conditions of nuclear site and being there and protecting what is patriotic, what is not patriotic. He was telling the military, the Ukrainian National Guard, that we are staying here, you guys can go. And at that time, in early hours of the war, the idea was to go and to cross into the Belarusian territory. They said, of course, they didn't know that Belarus was fully on the Russian side. That's a very interesting figure. He was really a go between the Russian occupied forces and the Ukrainian ones. Valery, the name will come back. A very interesting story, which is very characteristic of the people working on the station, and also people living in Slavutich. He's an ethnic Russian from the Volga region, who Valery Simonov, sorry for that, who came when he was a teenager, came to Chernobyl together with his parents. And you listen to him, he has very interesting language. It was Russian, mostly Russian, but also with some elements of not Russian spoken in Ukraine with some dialectical features from Volga. And also some dialectical features, Ukrainian dialectical features from Polisia. So even in his language, he was kind of combining these two worlds. He was negotiating between the commanders and Heiko. Doing excellent job. He gave a lot of interviews, a lot of what I have in the book based on his recollections, because he knew he saw both sides. And he was eventually accused of collaboration out of all of them. Not publicly, but he was investigated. After the liberation, he joined the Ukrainian armed forces. He was killed a few months ago near in Donbass, near Pokrovsk, it seems to be. So I put a post on my Facebook. The book was out. He didn't see the book. Which brings me to the changes in the Ukrainian society since this is the role of women there. Is of course there were women there. This is Lyudmila Kozak. So imagine there were 3 of you working in a small office, and you came for 12 hours work. And now you're staying there indefinitely. The shift never ends. You live there, you sleep there. The drunken Russian soldiers around. Half of the garbage that is being removed are empty bottles. So it's the strategy of women surviving in these conditions that very much reminded me about the German women in 1945 in Berlin. So she would establish good personal relations with the top commander. Is the idea that actually can protect her. She refused to follow the rules because the demand of the Russian occupational forces at Chernobyl, but also in other areas, was that you are wearing the white bandits. People were reminded immediately about Holocaust and things like that. She refused to wear white band, and eventually the Russian soldiers told her, look, in the dark, we will not see the band. We will actually take you for some intruder. We'll shoot you. You will die. So she goes to the Russian general and says, "Okay, may I wear the white cap, something that was part of the." He said yes. He goes and gets a scarf where there was blue and yellow threads, and embroiders Ukrainian trident on a white hat, and walks through the entire occupation in this white hat. That's deputy mayor of Enerhodar, the city of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, marching in earlier days of occupation. He was arrested, kidnapped. Don't know whether anyone heard about him or not, but the mayor actually was able to live in Enerhodar later. Which brings me to again, this is my second attempt to approach the topic about the changes in the Ukrainian society. First of all, something that I talked already about, that these guys are cut off from Kiev, from everywhere else. They're inside of occupied Russian territory. And they are making decisions on their own. There is no legislation, there are no orders, there is nothing. They decide on their own what they are going to do, what is cooperation, what is not cooperation, what is loyalty, what is not loyalty. But they also, that's a big change from 1986. But there is also change in Ukraine that is manifested there since 2004 and 2014. The cities that ended up under the Russian occupation, the Enerhodar and also the Slavutich, which created its own self-defense unit. They were fighting the battle. Eventually, they had to reduce. The Slavutich in particular, that was the youngest city in the Soviet Union, maybe the last city built in the Soviet Union after Chernobyl, because Pripyat could not be used. It was the most international city in Ukraine, because people and cadres were coming from all over the Soviet Union. And that was the city that until 2014 voted for the Party of Regions. And now you see this city, very international, with people like Valery Semyonov, Russian background or Tajik background or something like that, living there. And they are deciding on their own. They're already all in the rear of the Russian army, of who they are and what their loyalties are supposed to be. And these cities decide that they're actually Ukrainian, that they will be fighting for Ukraine. They're marching in Enerhodar, they're fighting, after they learned what happened to Enerhodar, they're fighting with weapons in Slavutich. And eventually, with the help of the personnel who threatens to blow up nuclear power plant, they insist that the Russian army actually would leave after they moved into Slavutich, that they would leave Slavutich. Which tells me a lot about changes in the Ukrainian society and explains why this war didn't end in 2 weeks. That was a sense of the civic identity that we see in this, the last elements, the most imperial cities that ever were, the last islands of the Soviet Union and Soviet identity, mobilizing, taking weapons, threatening to blow up nuclear power plant and fighting back in the ways that also are actually not prescribed by the government, because no one actually can tell you what to do or what not to do. Those mayors, they ended up in completely impossible position, an impossible situation, figuring out what is loyalty, what is not loyalty. And that was again, one thing that was very interesting to see and insight for me for understanding the war, at least the original point of the war. A lot of change on the Ukrainian side on a number of levels, very little change on the Russian side in terms of the Soviet way of thinking and acting and adding, as I said, really the army of workers. And again, that's this. It is documented in the book, but it's certainly widely known. It is not the case now, given that the front line stopped to move and the territories that Russians are taking are completely destroyed. But that was the story certainly the first weeks of the. Yeah, that's the Enerhodar. Sorry, the Slavutich that was cut off of the city. Interesting story. The Slavutich was built by representatives from different republics, so a friendship of people kind of manifestation. And in Georgian quarters, they built mangals. Those mangals really saved the day for at least part of the Slavutich. Now let me talk in the remaining couple minutes about the international implications. So what did we get there? Was quite unprecedented. The first time the nuclear sites were attacked and bombed before. The Israel bombed and the United States bombed nuclear sites in the Middle East before what happened now. But those we don't know what is the full information about Iran's the impact and what was there. But the bombings that were happening before were happening at the sites that actually were not either under construction, not fully developed, and so on and so forth. So the threat of the nuclear contamination was quite low. In Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, we got for the first time the army, the battlefield coming to the nuclear power plant. In Zaporizhia, it was on TV, on the feed, on the YouTube feed, in live. There was the battle, there were fighting, there were missiles, there were tanks moving, there were building catching fire. So that's unprecedented. For the first time in history, we have the war fully, not just the bombing coming to the nuclear site. No one was prepared. There is, of course, none of the reactors were built with the idea that to withstand attack. There is no protocols. You don't know whether you leave the place or you run. What is loyalty? What is not loyalty? No protocols to deal in those conditions, and absolute unpreparedness also of international community to deal in any way with the crisis. The International Atomic Energy, there is the Director General, Rafael Mariano Grossi, got a lot of negative coverage for not being able to do anything. For the first 3 or 4 weeks, the impression was like they spilled coffee on their computer and the letters that typed word Russia got stuck. They would not pronounce word Russia. They would issue appeals to both sides to exercise this and that. And then I looked at that, and they're not particularly unique in that sense. They're one of the UN, United Nations organizations. Russia is member of the Security Council. The prospects of Mr. Rafael Grossi to stay in the position or become, the rumor is to become the next head of the UN, very much depends on the Russian vote, or on the French vote, or anybody else's vote, right? So the mandate of International Atomic Energy Agency actually doesn't include dealing with the war conditions. The people whom they sent to Zaporizhia to sit there on the potential nuclear bomb are saying we didn't sign up for that. There is a crisis inside of the organization, even with what they were trying to do. You look at the legal base, it's absolutely absent. The most important legislation or international convention that is there, addition to the protocol, I don't remember now, of the Geneva Convention on the treatment of civilians and civil objects, treat the nuclear power plants together with the hydroelectric power stations. And there are loopholes. You can attack nuclear power plant if you think that the other side, the danger is. So what Russia did actually technically is not even prohibited by the convention. It is prohibited, but there is a way to get around it. So there is no legal base, there is no organization, there is no institution to deal with the crisis like that. And we have 440 reactors in the world. None of them were designed for that sort of conditions. No one said that this is the last war that anyone is fighting. The most ironic episode, it's sad irony, but occurred last year when the Ukrainians moved into Kursk Oblast and started to approach the Kursk nuclear power plant. What we heard from Russia was exactly the same as we heard from Kiev in February of 2022, where International Atomic Energy Agency, why they can't do anything. So this is something that is completely not regulated, a major issue and continuing major threat, certainly in Ukraine, given the continuing occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So when people talk about the nuclear threat in Ukraine, it's most often what is discussed is the use of nuclear weapons, which is and continues to be a taboo. And it is a taboo because there is a political price and other price and economic that whoever uses nuclear weapons would pay for that. But an accident at the nuclear power plant, we saw the Kakhovka Dam being blown up, and the international community hasn't decided yet who is right and who is wrong. Turning nuclear power plant into a dirty bomb is actually politically cost-free as opposed to use of the nuclear weapons. And this not to mention that just irregular accidents can happen. In Chernobyl, in my Chernobyl book, I discuss the crisis that occurred when all the power lines that were bringing electricity to Chernobyl were cut off because of the either Russian decision to do that or because of the war. And this is what you get there is a situation of Fukushima. The plant that is not producing electricity, but needs electricity to power the pumps and to keep cool the spent fuel. So you don't need to attack nuclear power plant. What you need is just to conduct the warfare in the neighborhood, and you create another Fukushima. This is a warning to the world that I'm afraid was not really heard or really acted on, and should be, because this is a story with implications that go beyond. Thank you very much for your attention.
Any sense of optimism that national community institutions will step in and?
The good news is that we didn't have so far accident at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. The good news is there not because of the actions of the Russian army, but because of position taken by people like Valentin Heiko, Valery Semyonov, and others. But we can't count on luck, right? And the luck being there and continuing. But that's the good news. Those guys bought time for all of us, and that's good in itself. But again, action is needed, and again, the situation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of course for a huge concern.
We have time for questions. First.
Hello, I'm Melania Korzonka. I'm here on the course of the Ukrainian Religion Knowledge, but in my real life, I work for the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House and in London think tank. I'm quite interested in your assessment in terms of, because obviously like in the early days when the occupation, well, the full-scale invasion was kind of progressing, there was quite a lot of fog of the war around the issue of the occupation of the nuclear plant. And I think some people were saying there's actually not that much risk. Some people were saying the risk is huge. What is your current assessment now? What would have been the worst case scenario associated with what could have gone like really wrong kind of from perspective of time? Like what was the actual kind of like maximum risk for it?
Thank you. The biggest risk was related to the loss of the power and overheating the fuel elements in those cooling ponds. People and physicists are basically were divided at that time, and I'm discussing this in the book. So the discussion was whether it would be a global accident or just a local one, so that there would be a release of radiation. There is no question about that, but the majority believe that given how long they are already in the pond, that probably it would be local one, which probably is a comforting thing for someone writing about that from London, and not so much uplifting, right? So uplifting thing for someone in Slavutich or in the area, or maybe even in Kiev. So define local and where the wind would go. Zaporizhzhia was a much more serious risk, given that the reactors were, it seems to me, 1 or 2 were still operating and they were shut down. So, and especially given the warfare happening there. But that's again, I'm not a physicist. I can't say, but those were the opinions, local or global, and the majority believed that it was local.
Can I have a super quick follow-up question? What do you know about the actual radiation effects on the soldiers that were stationed there?
Okay. Thanks for that question, because it will allow me also to address other thing that I didn't address during my lecture. So the information was spread in March about the numerous cases of radiation poisoning and people coming to the hospitals in Belarus in particular, people being evacuated while vomiting and so on and so forth. My assessment, it was Ukrainian IPSO, the psychological operation. I was doing also forensic kind of a study of the online news and how they spread and from where. They were leaked through some, it seems to me, Belaruski Partizan or something, but one of those groups. The levels of radiation were not as high to produce the effect that you see in HBO miniseries on Chernobyl. But what those people were exposed to, actually a lot of lower dosages of radiation, something that pops up years and decades after you were there. And the mayor of Chernobyl, not of Chernobyl, of Slavutich, said that, formulated that very nicely. He said, they left Chernobyl, but Chernobyl will never leave them. So it wasn't a good thing for anyone who thinks about health to go into those trenches and spend any time there or be in the tank or sitting on the tank that goes through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, raising radiation levels around with the dust.
Thank you.
Questions? We have one from our online audience, actually more than one. Barbara Lemania, what do you think of the implications of the Budapest Memorandum and Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons? Essentially, that's an essential question.
Well, the implication is that certainly by removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine, the United States in particular, because the US was the major player, Russia was trying to pressure Ukraine, it didn't work very nicely, so US stepped in. What they did, the idea was, of course, that it's about security, to move everything in one place, that it would be easier to control. Russia had most of the expertise and also resources in the early 1990s to take control of the nuclear. So the concern was that there would be Russo-Ukrainian war, but with the nuclear weapons. So that was concern. But by removing those weapons and forcing Ukraine to do that, that policy created security vacuum in the center of Europe. Because one nuclear umbrella was removed, no other nuclear umbrella was there. If Ukraine would have nukes, no one imagines that there would be actually this war. This war is going for so long, and the Western support for Ukraine was so limited and measured because of one fact, the Russian nuclear weapons, nothing else. So nuclear weapons is extremely important part in that story, and the fact that Ukraine didn't have it in 2014 is basically a huge factor there. So security vacuums, it's not just the story of Eastern Europe or the story of the 21st century. That's a classic example. It certainly attracts other powers. It creates conflict. So that's also important to keep in mind in terms of whatever settlement will be reached with Ukraine, unless it continues to be in one way or another security vacuum. That means that the war is not over. It will continue with different actors, different names. That's kind of one of the lessons.
My name is Sergey. I'm from Ukraine. I live most of my life here in the US. I was active volunteer in various movements help in Ukraine, but
So London here is just.
my wife is professor from London. I have two questions. One is about Zaporozhye power station. Station. Is it? Do you have any conclusive information about what Russian forces staying there, doing that? Because through filter of a lot of propaganda on both sides, it's hard to make what's true, what's not. So they were saying that they were shooting right from the nuclear power plant because nobody would shoot them back. So that's one of the questions. And second, also, it's been numerous claims that Putin might use the station just to blow up as one of the last resorts. So would it be even possibility of doing, on your opinion?
Yes, thank you. So with Zaporizhia, one thing was that the Russian army already discovered in Chernobyl. This is a secured zone, right? So it's already a fortress. It's very convenient for any sort of headquarters or anything else. And it's secure zone also in a sense that actually the likelihood of Ukrainians shooting at it is minimal, both in terms of Ukrainians maybe not taking this risk, but also international community, that would turn international community against. So what Ukraine was trying to do, they were trying at some point, it seems to me in 23, to have operation with light weapons, so kind of a command operation, crossing the Dnieper River and trying to take over, and that operation failed. The station is used really to shoot at Nikopol, and Nikopol is in a very bad shape. So it is used really as a cover. What we also know is that the station is used for like a storage also for ammunition and weaponry and other things. So that's what we know. In terms of the risks, the biggest risks there again is every day there is a cooling down of that certain fuel there, which makes, if accident happens, it's again the difference between local and global. So it's moving closer and closer to local. And the biggest threat is just the cutting of the electricity lines, supply lines there. Water is a more long-term progress. They drilled certain things, but that's not enough to. That comes to the fore if they really try to restart new reactor, one of the reactors, because there is a discussion about that. Then water would become a major issue. For now, it's basically supply of the electricity for pumps and cooling water. What can happen or not happen? I have no doubt that if after Chernobyl, after Kakhovka, that if Putin believes that this is in strategic interest of Russia, that will be that is a very likely scenario. Especially given that again it can be blamed on Ukrainians, it can be blamed on accident, it can be blamed. There is no. If you drop, if you put bomb on the Oreshnik or whatever it is, people will figure out where the Oreshnik came from, what was the unit. It's like shooting down the airplane during the beginning of the war. It will be figured out. With Kakhovka, again, it's not clear who was there, who operated. So I think if that will be considered to be in the interest, I think that certainly would be on the table.
My name is Andrei Romanchuk, and then I'm an activist with Yellow Ribbon, or Zhata Strichka, which is a resistance group in the occupied territories of Ukraine, very close to the nuclear power plant. Given the loopholes that exist in attacking such areas, are there any current policy directives, any mechanisms, or anything that has worked in the past that can ensure one, safety for the citizens in the occupied territories from such an attack? Or in general, any policy mechanisms that can stop such an attack?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the whole thing is actually absolutely new, so there is no protocols. The only experience that Ukraine has is the experience of evacuation during the Chernobyl accident. So that's the only thing that people can look at and try to replicate if there is a need. The population has also experienced after Chernobyl in terms of what do you do, that you're staying inside. So that's the Chernobyl. It's the only thing that is there and can be useful. And of course, when it comes to the whatever happens in the occupied territories, the Ukrainian policies there are just not to hurt the population and go after the military targets like it is happening also in Russia. But I'm not familiar with any sort of ideas or protocols. I think that the both sides would more or less rely on what they learned during Chernobyl.
Thank you, Professor Plochy, for your interesting insights on the topic of lethal weapons. I have a question regarding the story of Dirty Bomb, because I remember 2022, 2023, there were like several statements from Ministry of Defense, Russian Ministry of Defense at that time, Shoigu, that Ukraine has Dirty Bomb and Ukraine is planning to use Dirty Bomb, which is of course Russian propaganda, but if such a like high profile figures making those statements, what is your opinion? Do you think Russian high-ranking establishment, they really think Ukraine has Dirty Bomb and Ukraine is planning to use Dirty Bomb? Or is it just like, just a narrative for propaganda to persuade Russians that, oh yeah, we invaded Ukraine because they have like, this Muslim thing?
Thank you. So the accusation started really with the start of the war, and the foundation was sort of the trigger for that was President Zelensky's speech in the Munich Security Conference a few days before the start of the war, where he said that, well, we have Budapest Memorandum, and the assurances or guarantees are not being honored by people who signed it. So maybe we should revisit the Budapest Memorandum. So the Budapest Memorandum, that's about Ukraine disarming itself and joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state. So Putin personally would be reference into that. And then there was, of course, the psychological operations on the Russian side. Okay, it's difficult to tell without any evidence that the Ukrainians already have the bomb. But you can also always say that actually there can be a dirty bomb, and again, Chernobyl in particular was used in that regard. That was the story of the March of 2022, and then the story popped up again in October of 2022, and that was the time when the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence were given 50% of the Russia using tactical nuclear weapons, given that the Russian front in Kharkiv region collapsed, and eventually they had to withdraw also from Kherson and so on and so forth. So in one case, the discussion about the dirty bomb was to justify the occupation of Chernobyl, because Chernobyl is the name that is generally recognized in the world, so people were asking questions. And then the second potentially was a preparation for the use of tactical nuclear weapons, so at least an attempt to signal the West that we are preparing to do that. The whole thing it's absolutely has no ground in general as far as I know. But theoretically speaking, if Ukraine pushed into the corner, creating a dirty bomb in Ukraine is not a big challenge. The attacks by Ukrainian missiles and by Ukrainian drones on Russian air bases show that such attacks can be undertaken also at the nuclear sites. So Ukraine is not talking about that, and this is very good. But Ukraine has a nuclear card of its own, both in terms of potentially creating dirty bombs or attacking nuclear sites again, if it gets to that. The accusation so far had no ground under it, but that's certainly something that can happen if again either Ukrainian state is on the verge of collapse, or there are groups that again the central command loses control of groups with their own resources and their own ability to attack targets. That's theoretically possible.
Thank you so much for your talk. And I would like to criticize you a bit because I've been spending my summer reading your books. And
Go ahead.
I haven't been to the beach. Thank you. Excellent. And my picture is going back to the big picture pertaining to Ukraine. Looking at the European Union and the United States, you hear every hour where the gentleman in the White House has a different decision in terms of what we're going to do with Ukraine. And with that, we don't hear accurate news or up-to-date news pertaining to Ukraine and what is going on a day-to-day basis. So my question is, I hear you saying that we really don't know, and Zelensky and Putin they are really very, very determined, obviously, to prevent one from winning, if you will. And my question is this accurate, what I'm hearing from you today with all the details with Chernobyl, that there doesn't seem to be a solution in sight? What are your thoughts pertaining to what might happen with Ukraine in the hopefully near future?
Sure.
Just jump in, the question from the audience online, basically very similar. What is the path forward for Ukraine particularly?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you for your question, and thanks for the question online. Yeah, that's the topic that I didn't touch at all today in this discussion of Chernobyl. Basically, my vision of the future is informed very much by history, which has its pluses and has its minuses. But what I can provide is basically a historical perspective, or look at the other experiences of the wars like that. All the talk about the peace happening this year, from the historical point of view, was nonsensical at all. I look at basically maybe the closest parallel in the 20th century history. This is the Korean War. And there we saw the negotiations going on for a number of years, and the war going on for a number of years as well. And the war eventually ending when both sides, for their own reasons, decided that actually they couldn't get advantage and improve their positions on the front line. which is very close to what you see in Ukraine, where the front line barely moved since the year 2022, since the first year. There are Russian advances, but they're quite limited. So the Ukraine by now is not, at least officially and non-officially, they're not talking about the return or immediate return to the borders of 91. The position that is taken by President Zelensky with negotiations with President Trump is that Ukraine is prepared for ceasefire. Not the recognition of the territories taken, that's not on the table, but Ukraine is prepared for some sort of ceasefire and armistice, right? Russia is not prepared because Russia thinks that it can improve its position, especially given the cracks in the Western coalition supporting Ukraine. So if Ukraine gets enough support today to hold the line, the Russian economy continues to deteriorate. The chances are that maybe next year, Putin can decide that actually he would more lose by continuing the war than that's the basically my best case scenario for the future. But as long as either because of the lack of the Western unity or the Ukrainian disastrous developments on the front line, or the Russian economy just bouncing back and getting around, if the thinking will be that you can still achieve more by continuing the war will continue. That's a historian talking to you, but again, history is there to also to be changed.
Couple more questions.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's following back to the dirty bomb. I'm wondering, so there's a lot of talk about Russia having or not having those nuclear bombs that actually would work. So I was wondering, is that a Ukrainian propaganda hoping that to appease the basically population of Ukraine, saying no, their bombs will not work, no stress, or yeah. So do they actually have the bombs, like I said?
Oh, certainly they have the bombs. The problem can be like with some of the Russian shelling and others that actually they don't explode, or they explode in the wrong place. But they have enough bombs for at least 1 out of 10 to work. So I don't think about that as basically as an important factor. If the decision will made, at least one of the bombs.
I had a question about the role of the International Atomic Energy Organization, or sorry, Association. What should its role be in the future? I mean, we saw with Chernobyl that it wasn't very responsive, and that the guidelines are not there for this kind of situation. So what should they do?
It's the future for them. What can they do?
Yeah, really, in case of the nuclear power plants, they can do a lot if their mandate is changed. And second, if there is some sort of international convention, something that wherever I can publicly or publish in articles, I'm trying to push. I'm quite optimistic that that can happen because every country that has nuclear sites on their territory is interested in that. Russians attacked Zaporizhzhia and took over Chernobyl. And they started to try where is the International Atomic Energy Agency when Ukrainians started to move to the Kursk. I mentioned the Ukrainian missiles and other things that can go not against those sides. So Russia is as vulnerable as Ukraine or any other country, and any country that has nuclear sides needs the legislation, needs institution, needs mechanism, how it can be protected. Technically, there can be an agreement of declaring that's what Ukrainians didn't invent that, but that's what they wanted at the very beginning. No fight, no fly zone. So again, international peacekeepers, it's a problematic thing, but again, that's something that all major powers are interested in because they're all. International Atomic Energy Agency has and can play a role. For that, again, legislation has to be changed, mandate has to be changed, and there has to be an agreement to all. At least major players, and then eventually they would push smaller countries to join in.
Time for one last question, probably.
Yeah, a small question. Maybe it's too wide open, but of the many subjects about which you've written books, this one is the history is, let's say, not finished yet. And so just what reflections about writing history on chapters that are still open?
Yes, thank you for this question. That's a really I don't know, terrifying experience for a historian, right? So we are so wise because we know how things ended. And here you don't know what the end is, and your entire training was about explaining something that already happened, and you know the outcome. The entire training is about wonderful thing getting to the archives. And you have all the time in the world to write about the 17th century development. If you don't publish it now, you can publish in 10 years and it will be still as important as it was before. So that was a huge challenge, especially in my first book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. So I cheated with this on the Chernobyl, because at least you have the beginning and the end, and it was microhistory. I was writing, it was such a relief. Still all the challenges were there, the information, the misinformation, the lack of sources. But I was writing on the episode that has the beginning. And that was a little bit of easier. It was easier on me as a historian, but it is a challenge thing. I just want to mention something that I found that was really a kind of silver lining for all the struggles with the lack of sources and ability of sources. You get in social media the kind of sources that historians never got in the past. Social media, people can text right now, put comments, how they feel now, how they think about that. Not the official document, not something that you write at the end of your life and how you remember it and how you structure, even put in the diary at the end of the day. I bring this example because you text in the middle of this lecture, and you can start at the beginning with high expectations, at the end disappointed, and you still tweeting, right? And I get this tweet and I see how this changes in time. The attack on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. You look at the comments that people are leaving at the site, at the website of the Ukrainian Nuclear Regulation Agency, where there are people, there are no normal people, there are people who work in the industry, so they exchange all sorts of engineering insights. And suddenly they see on TV this live stream of the war happening in real time, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. For 20 minutes or maybe more, the discourse changes. It becomes religious discourse. They ran out of the way how to explain that to help. It's Mother of God, help us, what is going on, and you would interview them now, they would not remember that or would not admit that, but it's there. So there are also some discoveries in terms of the new sort of the sources that social media creates, that historians of the 17th century would kill for that. Would not get that sort of source.
I think it's a wonderful question, wonderful answer. It gives us some optimism, at least to historians. It's not for the 17th century, but the rest of us. So thank you for this wonderful lecture and discussion. Thank you, our audiences. Here and two announcements. Tomorrow for students or our students, gonna be study break 6 p.m. and our special guest is Mr. Marhundova, who is here. So tomorrow we continue, and our next event on Wednesday next week, next Wednesday, same place, same time, and it's going to be a lecture by Olga Molenko, accountability and social media engagement of charitable organizations in Ukraine during the war. So please, you're all welcome to be here. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.